My name is Eleanor Whitaker, though everyone calls me Ellie, and at 82 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak this world could offer. The snow was falling thick outside my son's colonial home in Newton, Massachusetts, that Christmas Eve, covering the manicured lawn like a pristine blanket. Inside, the house buzzed with the kind of manufactured holiday cheer that comes from Pinterest boards and Instagram posts, rather than genuine warmth. I sat in what had become my designated corner of the living room, watching my family move around me like I was a piece of furniture they'd grown tired of, but couldn't quite bring themselves to donate. The navy blue dress I'd chosen specifically for tonight, the one with the pearl buttons that my late husband Robert used to say, made my eyes sparkle, felt suddenly too formal, too hopeful for what was unfolding before me. My son Peter, 54, and successful in that hollow tech entrepreneur way, kept checking his Apple Watch between conversations. His wife Sharon, 51 and perpetually posed like she was filming content for her lifestyle blog, had that tight smile she reserved for obligatory family interactions. She'd been documenting every moment of their perfect Christmas for her followers, but somehow the camera always seemed to turn away when I was in frame. The handmade gifts I'd spent weeks creating sat untouched under their 12-foot Fraser fur, a sweater I'd knitted for my granddaughter Lexi, complete with her college logo, and a wooden puzzle box I'd crafted for my grandson Aidan, the kind that required patience and persistence to solve. Two qualities I'd tried to instill in both of them during their childhood, back when I was still considered relevant to their upbringing. Lexi, 22 and fresh out of Boston University, with a degree in communications she'd never had to work for, barely looked up from her phone when I tried to engage her in conversation. "That's nice, Grandma," she'd murmur, her manicured fingers dancing across her screen. Aidan, 18 and about to start his freshman year at MIT, a school I'd helped fund with a check his parents never bothered to mention came from my account, was slightly more polite, but equally distant. It was Sharon who finally broached the subject that had been hanging in the air all evening like smoke from a smothered fire. "Ellie," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension reserved for elderly relatives. "Peter and I have been talking, and we're concerned about you living alone in that big house, especially with winter coming and all." I'd been expecting this conversation for months, ever since I'd mentioned having trouble opening a particularly stubborn jar of pickles during a phone call. In their minds, one moment of minor frustration had transformed into evidence of my declining competence. They'd forgotten that I'd been opening jars and running a real estate business and raising their father and managing household finances long before they were even born. "We've found this wonderful place," Peter added, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used with his employees when he was about to deliver bad news. "Brightview Hills. It's not a nursing home, Mom. It's a senior living community. Very upscale, very comfortable. They have activities and nurses on staff, and you'd have your own apartment." The brochure appeared as if by magic from Sharon's oversized designer handbag, glossy photos of smiling seniors playing chess and attending watercolor classes, as if being warehoused with other people's discarded relatives was some kind of extended vacation. I studied the pictures, noting the careful staging, the professional lighting, the way none of the residents looked like they had anywhere else they'd rather be. "It's temporary," Sharon continued, her hand resting possessively on Peter's arm. "Just until we can figure out a more permanent solution. Maybe sell the house, get you something smaller, more manageable." Her eyes glittered with the kind of calculating look I'd seen in business negotiations for 40 years. She was already mentally redecorating my home, already planning how to spend money she thought would soon be hers. I thought about that house, the 4-bedroom colonial in Wellesley Hills, where I'd raised Peter after his father walked out on us, where I'd built my real estate empire from the kitchen table while he played in the backyard. The house I'd paid for with commissions from deals I'd closed, while other women my age were attending bridge clubs and charity luncheons. The house that represented not just shelter but independence, accomplishment, a life well lived. Most of all, I thought about the down payment I'd written for this very house we were sitting in, the $200,000 check that had made their dream home possible when the bank had initially rejected their loan application. A gift that had never been acknowledged, never been thanked, never been remembered, except when they needed something else. As I sat there, surrounded by the detritus of their materialistic Christmas celebration, I realized something that cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. I wasn't just being discarded, I was being erased. My contributions to this family's success, my sacrifices, my love, all of it was being systematically deleted from their story. In their revised history, they were self-made, successful, deserving of everything they'd achieved without any help from the old woman who'd made it all possible. But as I reached for my coat, feeling the weight of the black leather portfolio I'd carefully tucked into the lining earlier that evening, I allowed myself a small smile. They'd made one critical error in their calculations. They'd forgotten that the quiet old woman they were so eager to discard was the same woman who'd built an empire in a man's world, who'd outmaneuvered seasoned investors and corporate lawyers, who'd accumulated wealth they couldn't even imagine. As Peter helped me into his Mercedes for the drive to Brightview Hills, I looked back at the house one last time. The windows glowed warm and golden, full of the family that no longer wanted me, but as I settled into the passenger seat and felt the papers crinkle against my chest, I whispered words that would have chilled them to the bone if they'd heard them. Let the games begin. The Brightview Hills lobby smelled like disinfectant masked with vanilla air freshener, a combination that immediately reminded me of hospitals and goodbyes. It was Christmas morning, and while normal families were opening presents and sharing breakfast, I was being processed like a piece of damaged goods being returned to the manufacturer. The intake coordinator, a woman named Janet with a kind of aggressively cheerful demeanor that comes from years of dealing with unwanted relatives, walked me through the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Now, Mrs. Whitaker, you'll be in our Garden View unit. It's just temporary, your son explained, until you're feeling more confident about living independently. Temporary. The word hung in the air like a lie we all knew but pretended to believe. I'd seen this script before, during my years in real estate. Adult children would bring their parents to view temporary housing, while secretly meeting with attorneys about power of attorney papers and estate planning. The elderly parent would be promised a short stay, just until they were back on their feet, while their children were already mentally dividing up their assets. My apartment was pleasant enough, a studio with a kitchenette, a small seating area, and a view of what was generously called a garden, but looked more like a courtyard with a few strategically placed planters. The furniture was the kind of generic, institutional pieces designed to be inoffensive and easily replaceable, nothing that would encourage personalization or long-term attachment. The staff treated me with the kind of well-meaning condescension I'd expected. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Whitaker?" the nurse asked, as if aging had somehow made me plural. "Did we eat all our breakfast?" They spoke in the plural first person, as if I'd reverted to childhood and needed to be managed like a wayward toddler. But it was Luis, the maintenance man, who first made me feel like I might still be visible in this place. He was changing the air filter in my unit when he paused, studying my face with the kind of recognition that comes from somewhere deeper than casual acquaintance. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "didn't I see you in the Boston Globe once? Something about real estate?" I'd forgotten about that article from 1987, when an ambitious young reporter had decided to write about women breaking barriers in traditionally male industries. The headline had read, "Boston's Quiet Millionaires, the Women Building Empires Behind the Scenes." I'd been reluctant to be interviewed, but the reporter had been persistent, and Robert had finally convinced me it would be good for business. "That was a long time ago," I said. But Louis shook his head. "My father was a carpenter back then. He did some work on those condos you developed in Cambridge. He always said you were the fairest contractor he'd ever worked with, paid on time, never tried to cheat the workers." As Luis finished his work and left, I found myself remembering that woman from the newspaper article, Eleanor Whitaker, co-founder of Whitaker & Associates Real Estate, the woman who'd started with a $5,000 loan and built it into a company worth millions. The woman who'd been quietly buying and developing properties while her husband got the credit and the public recognition. I'd been content to let Robert be the face of the company, especially in those early days when female business owners were still viewed with suspicion. But I'd been the one reading the market trends, identifying the undervalued properties, negotiating the deals that made our fortune. When Robert died 8 years ago, I'd been the one who'd sold the company and managed the transition, turning our partnership into a trust that would provide for our son and his family for generations. That night, unable to sleep in the narrow institutional bed, I opened my laptop A gift from Aidan that his parents had rolled their eyes at, as if 82-year-old women had no business with technology. I logged into my email and found a message that made my pulse quicken. It was from my attorney, Judith Hale, now 73, and officially semi-retired but still sharp as a blade. Ali, the message read, "I've been thinking about our conversation last month regarding the trust provisions. Given recent developments, I wanted to confirm, are you sure you want to activate Clause 7A? Once we begin this process, there's no going back. The consequences will be significant. Please call me when you're ready to discuss the implications." Clause 7A. I'd insisted on including it when we'd originally drafted the trust documents, over Robert's objections. He'd thought it was too harsh, too punitive. But I'd been managing rental properties for 20 years by then, and I'd learned that some people only understood consequences when they were spelled out in unforgiving legal language. The clause was designed to protect the trust assets from reckless disregard by the beneficiaries. It gave me, as the primary trustee, complete discretionary control over all distributions if I determined that the heirs were using the trust funds irresponsibly or treating the trust grantor, me, with what the lawyers had termed demonstrated contempt or abandonment. I'd never imagined I'd need to use it. When we drafted the trust, Peter had been a devoted son, calling twice a week, bringing his children to visit every Sunday. The idea that he would someday dump me in a nursing home on Christmas morning would have been unthinkable. But here I was, sitting in a sterile apartment, having been literally discarded by the family I'd spent my life supporting. I thought about the $250,000 Peter had withdrawn from the trust 6 months ago, money he'd claimed was for a wellness retreat investment opportunity that had never materialized. I'd approved the withdrawal because I'd trusted him, because I'd believed his assurances that it was a solid business opportunity. I'd later learned from his neighbor that he and Sharon had spent the money on a luxury vacation to Bali and a down payment on a weekend house in the Hamptons. I closed the laptop and walked to my small window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard. Somewhere across the city, my family was probably sleeping off their Christmas celebration, comfortable in their assumption that they'd successfully warehoused the old woman who'd outlived her usefulness. They had no idea that the helpless grandmother they'd discarded was the same woman who'd built their comfortable life from nothing. As I prepared for bed, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to teach my family a lesson about respect, about gratitude, about the consequences of treating people like disposable objects. I was going to show them exactly who Eleanor Whitaker really was. But first, I was going to need some help. And as I drifted off to sleep, I was already planning my first recruitment meeting. The next morning, I called Judith Hale from the privacy of my apartment, using the secure line she'd given me for sensitive legal matters. At 73, Judith was one of the few people I trusted completely, a brilliant attorney who'd built her career fighting for women's rights and estates law, when both fields were dominated by men who considered us decorative accessories rather than serious professionals. "Ellie," her voice crackled through the phone, warm but concerned. "I've been worried about you since Peter called my office last week, asking about trust distributions. He seemed to think you were becoming confused about financial matters." I felt a chill run down my spine. "He called you. He wanted to know about the process for removing a trustee due to cognitive decline. I told him that would require a court order and medical evaluation, but I was concerned about what prompted the inquiry." Now I understood the urgency behind my exile to Brightview Hills. It wasn't just about getting me out of the way, it was about building a case for incompetence, creating a narrative that would support a legal challenge to my control over the trust. By placing me in a facility, Peter could argue that I was no longer capable of managing financial affairs, that I needed to be replaced by someone more reliable. "Tell me about Clause 7A, I said, settling into the uncomfortable chair by my window. "I need to know exactly what options I have." Judith's voice took on the precise tone she used when explaining complex legal concepts. "Clause 7A gives you complete discretionary control over all trust distributions if you determine that the beneficiaries have demonstrated reckless disregard for the trust assets or contempt for the trust grantor. It's essentially a nuclear option. You can freeze all distributions pending a comprehensive review. And then, Then you have 6 months to decide whether to resume distributions, modify the terms, or redistribute the assets to different beneficiaries entirely. The clause was designed to protect against exactly this kind of situation: family members who take advantage of your generosity while showing no appreciation or respect for your contributions. I thought about the documentation I'd been quietly gathering for months, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to put my finger on exactly what. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, credit card receipts for luxury purchases made with trust funds. Most damning of all, email exchanges between Peter and Sharon that I'd discovered on the family computer during my last visit to their house. In those emails, they'd discussed their plan to have me declared incompetent, to gain control of the trust assets, to sell my house and use the proceeds to fund their lifestyle. They'd referred to me as the old woman, as if I were already dead, and they were simply dividing up my remains. I have evidence, I told Judith. Unauthorized withdrawals, fraudulent investment claims, a pattern of deception going back at least 2 years. But Judith, there's something else. They're trying to build a case against my competence. This nursing home placement is part of a larger strategy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Judith spoke, her voice tight with anger. Those bastards. Forgive my language, Ellie, but I've seen this before. Adult children who view their parents as obstacles to their inheritance rather than human beings deserving of respect. What do I need to do? First, we document everything. Every unauthorized withdrawal, every lie, every instance of contempt or abandonment. Then we activate Clause 7A and freeze all distributions immediately. They'll have 30 days to contest the action, but they'll need to prove that their behavior has been appropriate, which they can't do. I spent the next hour walking Judith through the evidence I'd gathered. The $250,000 investment that had never existed, the vacation to Bali that had been charged to the trust account, the down payment on the Hamptons house that had been disguised as a business expense, the pattern of lies and deception that had escalated over the past year. Most importantly, I told her about the nursing home placement itself, how it had been presented as temporary when Peter had already been inquiring about having me declared incompetent, how they'd waited until Christmas morning to exile me, knowing it would be emotionally devastating, how they'd shown no concern for my well-being, only for their access to my assets. This is textbook financial elder abuse, Judith said, her voice hard as granite. They're using emotional manipulation and institutional placement to create a narrative of incompetence while systematically looting the trust. It's exactly what Clause 7A was designed to prevent. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose, of power, of control over my own destiny. For too long, I'd been reactive, responding to Peter and Sharon's manipulations with hurt feelings and wounded acceptance. Now I was going to be proactive, strategic, decisive. But I wasn't going to do it alone. During my 40 years in real estate, I'd learnt that the most successful projects were collaborative efforts, bringing together people with different skills and perspectives to achieve a common goal. I was going to need allies, people who understood the stakes and shared my commitment to justice. That afternoon, I made my way to the common room, where a group of residents was playing bridge. I'd been avoiding group activities since my arrival, preferring to nurse my grief in private. But as I observed the players, I realized I'd been underestimating my fellow residents. These weren't broken-down old people waiting to die. They were accomplished individuals with decades of experience, wisdom and connections. Rita Hernandez, 81, was a retired federal judge who'd presided over complex financial crimes cases. Dolores Wang, 79, was a former IRS investigator who'd specialized in tax fraud and money laundering. Harvey Goldman, 76, was a retired investment banker who'd spent his career analyzing financial statements and identifying irregularities. As I watched them play, I realized that Brightview Hills hadn't just warehoused me, it had inadvertently assembled a team of experts with exactly the skills I needed to execute my plan. I was going to need their help, but first I was going to need to earn their trust. That evening I called Judith with my decision. Activate Clause 7A. I told her. Freeze all distributions immediately. And Judith, I'm going to need copies of all the financial records. It's time my family learned who they're really dealing with. As I ended the call, I felt a familiar thrill, the same sensation I'd experienced during my biggest real estate deals, when all the pieces were falling into place and victory was finally within reach. Peter and Sharon had made one critical error in their calculations. They'd forgotten that the quiet old woman they'd discarded was the same woman who'd built an empire from nothing. Now they were going to learn exactly what that meant. 3 days into my residency at Brightview Hills, I approached Rita Hernandez during her morning coffee in the sunroom. She was reading the Wall Street Journal with the kind of focused intensity that told me she was still tracking markets and legal developments, despite her retirement. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a navy blazer that somehow made her look more like a presiding judge than a nursing home resident. "Judge Hernandez," I said, settling into the chair across from her. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about a legal matter, a rather complex one, involving trust law and financial irregularities." Rita looked up from her paper, her dark eyes sharp and evaluating. "I'm retired, Mrs. Whitaker, and please call me Rita, but I'm always interested in interesting legal problems. What kind of irregularities are we talking about?" I outlined the situation carefully. The trust structure, the unauthorized withdrawals, the pattern of deception, the nursing home placement designed to build a case for incompetence. Rita listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her complete understanding of the legal complexities involved. "You need documentation," she said finally. "Financial records, email communications, evidence of the fraudulent investment claims. Do you have access to these materials?" "My attorney is compiling everything, but I'm going to need help analyzing it all, identifying patterns, building a case that will stand up to scrutiny." Rita smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived at Brightview Hills, I felt like I was talking to an equal rather than someone who viewed me as a confused old woman. "I think I know some people who might be able to help with that. Are you free for dinner tonight? I'd like you to meet some friends of mine." That evening, Rita led me to a corner table in the dining room where Dolores Wang and Harvey Goldman were already seated. Up close, I could see the intelligence in their eyes, the way they carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd spent their careers solving complex problems. Dolores was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the kind of presence that comes from years of authority. During her career with the IRS, she'd investigated some of the most sophisticated financial crimes in the country. Harvey was tall and distinguished, with the kind of silver hair and expensive watch that suggested he'd been very successful in his banking career. "Rita tells us you have a family problem," Dolores said without preamble. "The kind that involves money and people who think they're smarter than they actually are." I spent the next hour walking them through the details of my situation. Harvey took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking questions about specific transactions or timeline details. Dolores seemed particularly interested in the pattern of deception, the way Peter and Sharon had escalated their schemes over time. "Classic escalation pattern," she said. "They started small, testing your boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. When you didn't push back, they got bolder. The nursing home placement is the end game. They're moving to eliminate your oversight entirely." Harvey looked up from his notes. "The financial picture is actually quite straightforward. They've been systematically looting the trust, using their access to fund a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. The fake investment story is particularly damning. It shows premeditation and deliberate deception." "What do you need from us?" Rita asked. "I'm assuming you didn't seek us out just for moral support." I took a deep breath. "I need help building an airtight case. I need someone who understands financial investigations, someone who can analyze the legal implications, someone who can help me develop a strategy that will hold up under scrutiny. I need a team." The three of them exchanged glances, and I could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Rita spoke. "We've been looking for a project, something more meaningful than bridge games and craft sessions. This sounds like exactly the kind of challenge we need." "What do you have in mind?" Dolores asked. "I'm thinking we form a task force. We meet regularly, divide up the work, use our combined expertise to build a comprehensive case. We operate discreetly, keep detailed records, document everything we discover." Harvey smiled. "Like a corporate investigation team. I like it. We'll need secure communication, document storage, maybe some basic surveillance capabilities. I can set up encrypted email accounts, Rita offered. And I still have contacts in the legal community who might be helpful. Over the next week, our informal task force, which Harvey had dubbed the Senior Syndicate, began to take shape. We met every evening after dinner, using the small conference room that was supposedly reserved for family meetings. Rita had somehow convinced the staff that we were planning a current events discussion group. Dolores established herself as our financial investigator, using her decades of experience to trace the money trail and identify patterns of fraud. Harvey became our strategic analyst, evaluating the broader implications of each discovery and helping us understand how the pieces fit together. Rita served as our legal expert, ensuring that everything we did would be admissible in court if necessary. I was the client, but I was also the operational coordinator, the one who understood the family dynamics and could provide context for the financial irregularities we were uncovering. It felt remarkably similar to the real estate development projects I'd managed for 40 years, bringing together specialists to solve complex problems. Our first breakthrough came when Judith delivered a box of financial records to the facility. Hidden among the bank statements and credit card receipts was a folder of emails that Peter had apparently forgotten to delete from the family computer. The correspondence between him and Sharon was damning: casual discussions of my declining mental state, strategic planning for the nursing home placement, and most shocking of all, detailed calculations of how much they stood to gain from my death. "This is evidence of conspiracy," Rita said, her voice cold with professional anger. "They're not just stealing from you, they're actively planning to accelerate your demise." Dolores had been equally busy, using her investigative skills to trace the flow of money from the trust account to various luxury purchases. The Bali vacation, the Hamptons house, Sharon's designer handbags, Peter's new Tesla, all of it funded by money that was supposed to be preserved for future generations. "They've stolen over $400,000 in the past 2 years, she reported, and that's just what I can document. I suspect there's more, but they've gotten better at hiding their tracks." Harvey's analysis was perhaps the most chilling. Based on their spending patterns and the current trust balance, they're on track to deplete the entire account within 5 years. They're not just stealing from you, they're stealing from their own children's inheritance. As our investigation deepened, I felt a familiar sense of momentum building, the same feeling I'd experienced during my biggest real estate deals, when all the research and planning was finally coming together into a coherent strategy. But this time, the stakes were personal. One evening, as we were reviewing our latest findings, Harvey asked the question that had been lurking in the back of my mind. "What's the end game here, Ellie? Are we just documenting their crimes, or are we planning to do something about it?" I looked around the table at my 3 allies, these brilliant individuals who'd been written off by their own families as irrelevant relics of the past. "We're going to stop them," I said. "We're going to freeze their access to the trust, document their crimes, and make sure they face consequences for what they've done." Rita smiled grimly. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been thinking about this, and I believe we have enough evidence to trigger your trust's fraud provisions. We can cut them off immediately." That night, I called Judith with our decision. "Freeze the accounts," I told her. "All of them, and Judith. It's time to activate the nuclear option. I want to invoke my right to redistribute the entire trust to new beneficiaries." As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in months. The game was changing, and for the first time, I was playing to win. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd instructed Judith to freeze the trust accounts. Peter's voice was tight with panic, a sound I'd never heard from my confident, successful son. "Mum, there's been some kind of mistake with the trust. My card was declined at the college bursar's office when I was trying to pay Lexi's spring tuition, and Sharon's business account is showing insufficient funds." I was sitting in my apartment, sipping coffee, and reviewing the latest financial documents that the senior syndicate had analyzed the night before. The evidence of fraud was overwhelming: $400,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, luxury purchases disguised as business expenses, and a systematic pattern of deception that had escalated over 2 years. "I'm sorry to hear about your difficulties," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Have you spoken with the bank about the problem?" The bank says the accounts are frozen pending a review by the trustee. But you're the trustee, Mum. You can fix this with a phone call. There was an edge to his voice now, the kind of barely controlled frustration that I'd seen him use with his employees when they weren't moving fast enough to suit him. I'm aware of the situation, Peter. The trust is undergoing a comprehensive audit due to some irregularities that have come to light. Until that review is complete, all distributions are suspended. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Peter finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the patronizing tone he'd used when discussing my confusion about financial matters. Now he sounded like a man who was beginning to understand that he'd seriously underestimated his opponent. What kind of irregularities? Unauthorized withdrawals, fraudulent investment claims, the use of trust funds for personal expenses. The kind of irregularities that constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially criminal fraud. I could hear Sharon's voice in the background, sharp and demanding, though I couldn't make out the words. Peter covered the phone for a moment, and when he came back, his tone had shifted to the kind of wheedling desperation that I'd heard from failed business partners over the years. Mum, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The Bali trip was a business expense. We were exploring international investment opportunities, and the Hamptons house is an investment property that will appreciate in value. I can explain everything if you'll just release the funds. I'm sure you can explain everything, Peter. In fact, I'm looking forward to your explanations. My attorney will be in touch with you soon to schedule a formal review of all trust transactions from the past 2 years. That afternoon I received a text message from Lexi that made my heart ache despite everything. Grandma, I don't understand what's happening. Dad says you're blocking my tuition payment. I thought you loved me. Why are you doing this? I showed the message to Rita during our evening meeting, and she shook her head with disgust. Classic manipulation tactic. They're using the grandchildren as emotional leverage, making you the villain in a situation they created. Dolores looked up from the financial record she was reviewing. The tuition payment isn't even due until next month. They're panicking because they can't access the money they've been stealing, so they're trying to make you feel guilty about an imaginary crisis. Harvey had been quiet during our discussion, but now he spoke up. There's something else you should know. I've been tracking their spending patterns, and they're in serious financial trouble. Sharon's influencer business is essentially a money laundering operation. She's been funneling trust funds through fake brand partnerships and promotional deals. He showed me a spreadsheet that detailed the scheme. Sharon had been creating fake contracts with fictional companies, then using trust funds to pay for promotional services that never existed. The money had gone directly into her personal accounts, funding her lifestyle and business expenses. This is sophisticated fraud, Rita said. They've been planning this for months, maybe years. The nursing home placement was the final step. Once they had you declared incompetent, they could have drained the entire trust without any oversight. That evening, I received a call from Sharon herself. Her voice was different from the sweetly condescending tone I'd grown accustomed to. Now she sounded like a woman who was fighting for her survival. Ellie, I think we need to talk. There's been a terrible misunderstanding about the trust situation. I know you're upset about the nursing home placement, but that was just temporary, just until we could figure out the best way to take care of you. I'm being very well taken care of. Thank you, and I'm not upset about anything. I'm simply exercising my rights as trustee to investigate potential fraud and abuse. Fraud, Ellie. We're family. Everything we've done has been for the good of the family. The investments, the business expenses, all of it was designed to build wealth for the next generation. I thought about the evidence that Harvey had compiled. The fake contracts, the fraudulent investment claims, the systematic theft of money that had been intended to provide for their children's future. Which next generation are you referring to, Sharon? Because according to my analysis, you've been stealing from your own children's inheritance. The conversation ended abruptly when Sharon hung up on me, but not before I heard her scream something at Peter that included several words that would have made my mother wash her mouth out with soap. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from an attorney I'd never heard of, demanding that I restore access to the trust funds immediately and threatening legal action if I didn't comply. The letter was full of legal jargon designed to intimidate, but it contained no actual substance, just threats and bluster. They're panicking, Rita said after reviewing the letter. This is the kind of desperate legal maneuvering that happens when people realize they're caught. They're hoping to scare you into backing down. But I wasn't backing down. If anything, I was more determined than ever to see this through to the end. The senior syndicate had uncovered evidence of fraud that went far beyond what I'd originally suspected. They hadn't just stolen money, they'd created an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to systematically loot the trust while building a case for my incompetence. That night, I called Judith with my next set of instructions. I want to modify the trust terms. I told her, I want to remove Peter and Sharon as beneficiaries entirely and redistribute their shares to more deserving recipients. That's a significant step, Judith warned. Are you sure you want to go that far? I thought about the nursing home placement on Christmas morning, about the years of condescension and manipulation, about the way they'd tried to erase my contributions to their success. Most of all, I thought about the future they'd planned for me, isolated, declared incompetent, slowly dying while they spent my money on luxury vacations and designer handbags. I'm absolutely sure, I said. It's time they learned that actions have consequences, and it's time I showed them exactly who they'd been dealing with. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in years. The game was finally being played on my terms, and I was just getting started. Section 6. Public Shaming. The Boston Globe article appeared on a Thursday morning, buried on page 3 of the local section, but strategically placed where it would be noticed by the kind of people who mattered in Newton society. The headline read, Local Family Accused of Elder Financial Abuse in Trust Fraud Case. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in white-collar crime, had done her homework. I hadn't contacted the media directly. Of course, that would have been beneath my dignity and potentially damaging to my case. Instead, I'd mentioned my situation to Louis during one of our conversations, knowing that his sister worked as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in elder law. Word had a way of traveling in professional circles, especially when it involved the kind of sophisticated fraud that made for compelling news stories. The article was carefully written to avoid any direct accusations that couldn't be substantiated, but it painted a clear picture of a family that had systematically abused their elderly relatives' trust. Anonymous sources, whom I assumed were other attorneys familiar with the case, provided context about the growing problem of financial elder abuse among affluent families. That Sunday, I attended services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Newton, where I'd been a member for 37 years. I hadn't been to church since my arrival at Brightview Hills, but I felt it was important to show my face in the community, to demonstrate that I was still mentally sharp and socially engaged despite my children's claims of cognitive decline. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected. During coffee hour after the service, I was surrounded by concerned friends and acquaintances who'd read the article and wanted to express their support. Margaret Thornton, whose family had been members of the church for 3 generations, was particularly vocal in her indignation. Eleanor, I had no idea what you were going through, she said, her voice carrying the kind of moral authority that came from decades of community leadership. The very idea that Peter would treat you this way, after everything you've done for that family, it's absolutely unconscionable. Others nodded in agreement. The story had resonated with people who'd watched their own elderly relatives struggle with ungrateful children, who'd seen the way families could turn toxic when significant money was involved. I was no longer the confused old woman who'd been quietly warehoused in a nursing home. I was a victim of a crime that threatened the very fabric of family relationships. But it was what happened Monday morning that really drove the point home. I was having breakfast in the Brightview Hills dining room when Louis approached with a newspaper folded under his arm. Mrs. Whitaker, he said quietly, I thought you should see this. The Newton Tab, a local weekly newspaper that focused on community news and social events, had run a follow-up story about the trust fraud case. But this article was different. It included details about Peter and Sharon's lifestyle, their expensive cars, their multiple properties, their children's private school tuition. It painted a picture of a family that had been living far beyond their means on money that wasn't rightfully theirs. More importantly, it included a sidebar about the impact of financial elder abuse on the broader community. The article quoted statistics about the growing problem, interviewed other families who'd experienced similar situations, and positioned my case as part of a larger social issue that demanded attention. That afternoon I received a call from Marcus Johnson, a young man who'd been friends with Aidan during high school. Marcus had gone to UMass on a partial scholarship, working nights at a grocery store to pay for his expenses. I'd always been impressed by his work ethic and determination, and I'd occasionally helped him with small financial emergencies, car repairs, textbook costs, the kinds of expenses that could derail a student's education. "Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw the article about what your family did to you. I want you to know that what you did for me, helping me stay in school, believing in me when nobody else did, it changed my life. I'm a teacher now, and I think about your kindness every day." His words hit me harder than any of the legal documents or financial analyses I'd been reviewing. Here was someone who remembered my contributions, who valued my impact on his life, who saw me as a person rather than an obstacle to his inheritance. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at Brightview Hills. When he arrived, I handed him a check for $10,000, money from my personal account, not the trust. "I want you to pay off your student loans," I told him, "and I want you to remember that some families understand the value of education, of hard work, of respecting the people who help make their success possible." Marcus stared at the check, tears streaming down his face. "Mrs. Whitaker, I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can and you will," I said firmly. "Consider it an investment in the future, in the kind of young man who deserves support and encouragement, the kind of young man my own family used to be." Word of my gift to Marcus spread quickly through the community, as I'd known it would. Within days I was receiving calls from other young people I'd helped over the years. Kids who'd worked in my office during summer breaks, neighbors' children who'd needed help with college applications, young families who'd bought their first homes with my guidance. Each conversation reminded me of who I'd been before Peter and Sharon had begun their campaign to diminish me. I wasn't just a wealthy old woman with a substantial trust fund. I was someone who'd spent decades building relationships, supporting her community, using her resources to make a positive difference in people's lives. Meanwhile, the social consequences for Peter and Sharon were becoming increasingly severe. I heard through the church grapevine that they'd been quietly asked to step down from their positions on the Newton Country Club board. Sharon's influencer partnerships were being cancelled as brands distanced themselves from the scandal. Peter's business contacts were avoiding him, uncertain about his integrity and judgment. The financial pressure was mounting as well. Without access to the trust funds, they were struggling to maintain their lifestyle. I'd learned from Harvey that they'd taken out a second mortgage on their house and were behind on several credit card payments. The comfortable life they'd built on stolen money was beginning to crumble. But I wasn't finished yet. The senior syndicate had uncovered one final piece of evidence that would complete the picture of their deception. Harvey had discovered that Sharon had been using trust funds to pay for cosmetic surgery, luxury spa treatments, and a personal trainer, all disguised as health and wellness expenses that were supposedly legitimate trust distributions. "This is the smoking gun," Rita said during our evening meeting. "They've been using trust funds for purely personal expenses that have no legitimate connection to the trust's purpose. This is textbook conversion, and it's a felony." That night, I called Judith with my final instruction. "I want to file a formal complaint with the district attorney's office," I told her. "I want them investigated for criminal fraud, not just civil violations." "Are you sure?" Judith asked. "Once we cross that line, there's no going back. This becomes a criminal matter, not just a family dispute." I thought about the nursing home placement on Christmas morning, about the years of condescension and manipulation, about the way they'd tried to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my money without consequences. Most of all, I thought about the future they'd planned for me, isolated, powerless, slowly dying while they enjoyed the fruits of their theft. "I'm absolutely sure," I said. "It's time they learned that stealing from elderly relatives isn't just morally wrong, it's illegal. And it's time the community saw exactly what kind of people they really are." As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The game was almost over, and I was winning decisively. But the final act was still to come. The law offices of Hale and Associates, occupied the top floor of a historic brownstone in downtown Boston, with windows that looked out over the Common and the State House dome. I hadn't been there in years, but walking through the familiar hallways brought back memories of the dozens of real estate deals I'd negotiated in these rooms during my career. Judith's office was exactly as I remembered it. Floor-to-ceiling law books, a massive oak desk that had belonged to her grandfather, and photographs of the landmark cases she'd won over her 40-year career. At 73, she was still formidable, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. "Ellie," she said, rising from her chair to embrace me, "you look wonderful. Retirement from family obligations seems to suit you." I settled into the leather chair across from her desk, feeling more like myself than I had in months. The past week had been transformative, not just because of the legal actions I'd taken, but because of the way I'd reclaimed my identity as someone who mattered, someone whose opinions and decisions carried weight. "I want to draft a new will," I said without preamble. "Complete revision, new beneficiaries, new trust structure. I want to make sure that my assets go to people who will appreciate them and use them responsibly." Judith pulled out a legal pad and pen. "What did you have in mind?" I'd been thinking about this for days, ever since my conversation with Marcus and the flood of supportive calls from young people I'd helped over the years. The contrast between their gratitude and my own family's entitlement had crystallized something important in my mind. Wealth should be earned, not inherited, and it should go to people who would use it to build something meaningful rather than fund a lifestyle of conspicuous consumption. 50% to the Massachusetts Women's Shelter Network, I said. "They do important work helping women escape domestic violence and rebuild their lives. They understand the value of independence and self-reliance." Judith nodded approvingly. "Excellent choice. They're a well-managed organization with a strong track record." 20% to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, administered through the Boston Community Foundation. I want to help kids like Marcus who are working their way through school without family support. And the remaining 30%, 10% each to Luis Rodriguez, Rita Hernandez, and Dolores Wang. They've shown me more loyalty and support in the past month than my own family has shown me in years. Plus a special bequest to Harvey Goldman to cover his grandson's medical expenses. I'd learnt from Harvey that his grandson had been born with a rare genetic condition that required expensive treatments not covered by insurance. Harvey had been quietly depleting his retirement savings to help his daughter pay for the medical care, never complaining or asking for help. It was exactly the kind of selfless family support that I'd once provided for Peter and his children. "What about your grandchildren?" Judith asked. "Surely you want to provide something for them." I thought about Lexi and Aidan, about the way they'd been turned against me by their parents' manipulation. Part of me wanted to punish them for their complicity in my exile, but I recognized that they were as much victims of Peter and Sharon's schemes as I was. "Aidan will receive the Cambridge property," I said. "He's shown some signs of independent thinking, and I believe he might learn to appreciate the value of hard work and responsibility. But the inheritance will be held in trust until he's 25, with distributions tied to his academic performance and community service." "And Lexi?" "Nothing. She's shown no interest in maintaining a relationship with me, and she's completely under her parents' influence. If she wants to rebuild our relationship, she can do it on her own terms, not because she's expecting an inheritance." Judith was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. "This is a significant change from your previous will. Are you sure you want to exclude Peter entirely?" I thought about the little boy who'd helped me plant flowers in my garden, who'd brought me macaroni art projects from kindergarten, who'd called me twice a week during his college years. That boy had been replaced by a man who'd stolen from me, lied to me, and ultimately tried to have me declared incompetent so he could steal even more. Peter will receive $1 and a letter explaining why his inheritance was revoked. I said, I want him to understand that there are consequences for treating family members like disposable assets. As we worked through the details of the new will, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about punishing Peter and Sharon for their crimes. It was about ensuring that my life's work would continue to have meaning, that my money would go to people who would use it to build something valuable rather than fund a lifestyle of entitled consumption. The process took several hours, with multiple drafts and revisions to ensure that the language was precise and the intentions were clear. When we finished, I felt emotionally drained but satisfied. I'd reclaimed control over my legacy, ensuring that my assets would support causes and people I believed in. That evening, I had one final task to complete. I drove to the house in Wellesley Hills, where I'd raised Peter, where I'd built my real estate empire, where I'd created the wealth that had enabled my family's comfortable lifestyle. The house was dark and empty. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings after Peter defaulted on the mortgage payments. I sat in my car for a long time, looking at the darkened windows and remembering the life I'd built there. The barbecues in the backyard, the Christmas mornings when Peter was small, the countless hours I'd spent at the kitchen table working on business deals while he did his homework beside me. But I wasn't mourning the loss of those memories. Instead, I was celebrating the fact that I'd finally taken control of my own story, that I'd stopped allowing other people to define my worth and my role in the world. The woman who'd built this house, who'd raised a son and built a business empire, was still here. She'd been diminished and ignored, but she hadn't been destroyed. As I drove back to Brightview Hills, I thought about the future I was creating for myself. I wouldn't be spending my remaining years as a forgotten relic in a nursing home, warehoused by ungrateful relatives who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance. Instead, I would be living with purpose, using my resources to support causes I believed in, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and respected my autonomy. The game was almost over, but there was still one final move to make. And when I made it, everyone would understand exactly who Eleanor Whittaker really was. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that immediately told me Sharon had spared no expense. Mr. and Mrs. Peter Whittaker request the pleasure of your company at a celebration of their daughter Lexi's graduation from Boston University, summa cum laude, Bachelor of Arts in Communications. I stared at the invitation for a long time, remembering the little girl who used to climb onto my lap to hear stories about her grandfather, who'd helped me bake cookies for church fundraisers, who'd once told me I was her favorite person in the whole world. That little girl had grown into a young woman who'd stood by silently while her parents exiled me to a nursing home on Christmas morning. The graduation ceremony was being held at the Boston University School of Communication, followed by a reception at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. It was exactly the kind of expensive, showy celebration that Peter and Sharon favored, designed more for social media content than genuine celebration. I hadn't been formally invited, of course. The invitation had been sent to my old address in Wellesley Hills, and it had taken a week to be forwarded to Brightview Hills. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate slight, I couldn't tell, but as I sat in my apartment, looking at the elegant cardstock, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. I was going to attend my granddaughter's graduation, not because I'd been invited, but because I had something important to say. The morning of the graduation, I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to close my most important real estate deals, the one that made me feel confident and powerful. I'd spent an hour at the Brightview Hills salon, getting my hair styled and my makeup done. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I'd been, not the discarded old woman Peter and Sharon had tried to make me become. Rita, Harvey, and Dolores had offered to accompany me for moral support, but I'd declined. This was something I needed to do alone, something that required the kind of personal courage I'd relied on throughout my career, when I'd been the only woman in a room full of men who didn't think I belonged there. The graduation ceremony was held in the university's largest auditorium, with families packed into uncomfortable seats and proud parents clutching cameras and flowers. I slipped in quietly and found a seat in the back, where I could observe without being noticed. Peter and Sharon were in the front row, of course, along with what appeared to be Sharon's parents and several family friends. They looked prosperous and happy, like the kind of successful family that deserved to be celebrating their daughter's academic achievements. No one looking at them would have guessed that they were facing criminal fraud charges or that their comfortable lifestyle was built on stolen money. When Lexi's name was called, I felt a complicated mix of emotions: pride in her academic success, sadness at the distance that had grown between us, and anger at the way she'd been manipulated by her parents into viewing me as the enemy. She looked beautiful as she walked across the stage, confident and accomplished, ready to take on the world. The reception at the Fairmont Copley Plaza was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant, expensive, and designed to impress. Sharon had spared no expense on flowers, champagne, and a photographer to document every moment. The guest list included Peter's business associates, Sharon's influencer friends, and various Newton Society figures who'd known our family for years. I waited until the formal toasts were finished, and the crowd had begun to mingle before making my entrance. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and every eye in the room turned toward me. Peter's face went white when he saw me, and I watched him lean toward Sharon to whisper something urgent in her ear. Sharon's expression shifted from surprise to anger to something approaching panic as she realized what my presence might mean. But it was Lexi's reaction that interested me most. She stared at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hope. Despite everything her parents had told her about my mental decline and inappropriate behavior, she could see that I was completely coherent, elegantly dressed, and clearly in control of my faculties. I made my way through the crowd slowly, accepting congratulations from old friends and business associates who were genuinely pleased to see me. Many of them had heard about the trust fraud case and wanted to express their support. Their warmth and respect provided a stark contrast to the cold reception I was getting from my own family. When I finally reached the small stage where the podium had been set up for toasts, I climbed the steps without hesitation. The room fell silent as I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled guests. "Good evening," I began, my voice clear and strong. "For those who don't know me, I'm Eleanor Whitaker, Lexi's grandmother. I'm here tonight to celebrate my granddaughter's graduation and to share a few thoughts about family, legacy, and the importance of living with integrity." I could see Peter moving toward the stage, probably intending to stop me from speaking, but Harvey Goldman had slipped into the room during my entrance and was now blocking his path. The senior syndicate had my back, even when I'd insisted on facing this moment alone. "Lexi," I continued, looking directly at my granddaughter, "I want you to know how proud I am of your academic achievements. You've worked hard, and you deserve to be celebrated tonight. Your grandfather would have been thrilled to see the accomplished young woman you've become." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that something significant was happening, but not sure what to expect. I could see Sharon frantically whispering to Peter, probably debating whether to create a scene by forcibly removing me from the podium. "But I also want to talk about something else tonight," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I want to talk about the woman who made this celebration possible. The woman who paid for your education, who supported your family through difficult times, who built the wealth that enabled your comfortable lifestyle." I paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who'd known me for decades, who remembered the real estate empire I'd built, the community organizations I'd supported, the young people I'd helped over the years. "That woman is me," I said simply. "I'm the woman who co-founded Whitaker and Associates Real Estate, who built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, who worked 16-hour days to ensure that my family would never want for anything. I'm the woman who paid for the house your parents live in, who funded your college education, who created the trust that supported your family's lifestyle." The room was so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Every person in the room was hanging on my words, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. And I'm also the woman who was dumped in a nursing home on Christmas morning by children who'd decided I was no longer useful to them. The woman who was told I was confused about financial matters, while those same children stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the trust I'd created for their benefit. Lexi's face had gone pale, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was probably the first time she'd heard the full truth about what her parents had done, the first time she'd understood the real reason for my exile. "But here's what my family forgot," I said, straightening to my full height and speaking with the authority I'd developed over 40 years in business. "They forgot that I didn't become wealthy by accident. They forgot that I didn't build an empire by being weak or confused or easily manipulated. They forgot that the woman they were trying to discard was the same woman who'd created everything they were trying to steal." I looked directly at Peter and Sharon, seeing the fear in their eyes as they realized that their carefully constructed facade was crumbling in public. "Tonight, I want everyone in this room to understand something important. I am Eleanor Whitaker. I am 82 years old, and I am sharper, more determined, and more powerful than I've ever been in my life. I am not a victim. I am not confused. I am not helpless. I am a woman who built an empire, and I am a woman who will not be discarded without consequences. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Harvey Goldman began to applaud. Rita and Dolores joined him, followed by other guests who'd known me during my business career. Within moments, the entire room was applauding, and I could see the respect and admiration in their faces. As I stepped down from the podium, Lexi broke away from her parents and rushed toward me. She threw her arms around me, sobbing openly as she whispered, "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." I held her close, feeling the grief and anger of the past months, finally beginning to transform into something more powerful. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," I whispered back. "But it's time you learnt the truth about your family's history, and it's time you decided what kind of person you want to be." As we left the hotel together, I knew that the game was finally over, and I had won decisively. The conference room at Hale & Associates was packed with people who'd never expected to be in the same room together. Peter and Sharon sat at one end of the long mahogany table, flanked by two attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Lexi and Aidan sat nearby, both looking nervous and confused about why they'd been summoned to what had been described as a trust distribution review. At the other end of the table sat Luis Rodriguez, impeccably dressed in a new suit that made him look more like a successful businessman than a nursing home maintenance worker. Beside him were Rita, Harvey, and Dolores, the senior syndicate members who'd become my closest allies and confidants. Representatives from the Massachusetts Women's Shelter Network and the Boston Community Foundation completed the group. I sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had been my grandfather's and had witnessed countless important legal proceedings over the decades. At 82, I'd never felt more powerful or more in control of my destiny. Judith stood at the front of the room, holding a thick folder of documents. "We're here today for the formal reading of Eleanor Whitaker's revised will and trust distribution, as well as to address the findings of our investigation into fraudulent activities related to the original trust." Peter started to speak, but Judith held up her hand. "Mr. Whitaker, you'll have an opportunity to respond, but first we need to review the facts as they've been established by our investigation." She opened the folder and began reading from a detailed report that Harvey and Dolores had compiled over the past month. The litany of fraud was overwhelming. $400,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, fake investment schemes, personal expenses disguised as business costs, and a systematic pattern of deception that had escalated over 2 years. "The evidence shows clear violations of fiduciary duty, breach of trust, and criminal fraud," Judith continued. "More importantly, it demonstrates a pattern of elder abuse designed to isolate Mrs. Whitaker from her family while systematically looting her assets." Sharon's attorney, a young man who looked like he'd been hired more for his aggressive reputation than his legal expertise, interrupted. "My clients dispute these allegations. Any withdrawals from the trust were authorized and legitimate." Rita stood up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd presided over complex financial crimes cases for 30 years. "I've reviewed the evidence personally, and I can assure you that no legitimate court would accept those claims. Your clients have committed multiple felonies, and the evidence is overwhelming." I watched Peter's face as the full scope of his crimes was laid out in clinical detail. The confident businessman who'd patronized me for years had been replaced by a man who finally understood the consequences of his actions. He looked older somehow, diminished by the weight of his own choices. "Given these findings," Judith continued, "Mrs. Whitaker has exercised her rights under the trust's fraud provisions to revoke all distributions to Peter and Sharon Whitaker, effective immediately. She has also revised her will to redistribute their intended inheritances to more deserving beneficiaries." The room was silent as Judith began reading the new distribution list. 50% to the Massachusetts Women's Shelter Network, 20% to the Scholarship Fund, and individual bequests to Louise, Rita, Harvey, and Dolores. The representatives from the charitable organizations looked stunned by the magnitude of the gifts. When Judith announced that Aidan would receive the Cambridge property, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He'd been the only family member to show any remorse for the way I'd been treated, and I believed he might still have the capacity to learn from this experience. "And for Peter Whittaker," Judith said, her voice taking on a formal tone, "you are hereby bequeathed the sum of $1, along with this letter from your mother." She handed him a sealed envelope that I'd spent hours writing. Inside was a detailed explanation of why his inheritance had been revoked, a chronicle of the pain and betrayal he'd caused, and a final message about the importance of treating family members with respect and dignity. Peter stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. As he read, I watched his face cycle through a range of emotions: anger, disbelief, and finally something that might have been genuine remorse. When he finished, he looked up at me with eyes that were red with tears. "Mum," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I've made mistakes, but surely we can work this out. I'm still your son. You stopped being my son the day you decided I was more valuable as a source of money than as a person," I replied. "You made your choice, Peter. Now you have to live with the consequences." Sharon, who'd been increasingly agitated throughout the proceedings, finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. You can't just give away our inheritance to strangers. We're family." "You're right," I said calmly. "I can't give away your inheritance, but I can give away mine. And that's exactly what I've done." As the formal proceedings concluded, I watched the various parties react to the news. Luis looked overwhelmed by the gift that would transform his life and his family's future. Rita, Harvey, and Dolores seemed more pleased by the vindication of our investigation than by their individual bequests. The charity representatives were already discussing how they would use the funds to expand their programs. Aidan approached me as people began to leave. "Grandma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that I never supported what Mom and Dad did. I tried to talk them out of the nursing home idea, but they wouldn't listen." I studied his face, seeing something of the little boy I'd loved so much. "I know, sweetheart. That's why you're still included in my will. But you need to understand that your inheritance comes with responsibilities. You need to learn from your parents' mistakes and choose to be a better person." As I left the law office that afternoon, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in years. The game was over, and justice had been served. But more importantly, I'd reclaimed my identity as someone who mattered, someone whose choices had consequences, someone who would not be discarded without a fight. The woman who'd been dumped in a nursing home on Christmas morning had emerged victorious, having used the very skills that had built her empire to destroy those who'd betrayed her. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten by anyone who'd witnessed it. The moving truck arrived at Brightview Hills on a crisp October morning, exactly 10 months after I'd been deposited there on Christmas Day. I stood in the lobby, watching the workers carefully load my belongings, not the meager possessions I'd arrived with, but the accumulated treasures of a life well lived that I'd gradually retrieved from storage over the past few months. My destination was a charming cottage in Rockport, overlooking the harbour, where fishing boats bobbed in the morning light. I'd bought it with cash from my personal account, a modest but comfortable home that would serve as headquarters for the next chapter of my life. At 82, I was finally living exactly as I chose, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and respected my autonomy. Luis had given his notice at Brightview Hills the week before, officially accepting his position as my estate manager. His transformation from maintenance worker to trusted advisor was remarkable. He'd enrolled in evening classes to earn a certificate in financial planning, and his natural intelligence and work ethic had impressed everyone who worked with him. Rita had decided to leave Brightview Hills as well, moving to a senior community in Cambridge, where she could be closer to her daughter while maintaining her independence. She'd agreed to serve as the legal counsel for the non-profit I was establishing, Elder Protection Services, an organization designed to help elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse and family manipulation. Harvey and Dolores were staying at Brightview Hills, but they'd become the unofficial leaders of a new residents' council that advocated for better services and more respect for the facility's elderly residents. The senior syndicate had evolved into something larger and more meaningful, a network of accomplished individuals who refused to be marginalized simply because of their age. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity. The criminal charges against Peter and Sharon had resulted in plea agreements that included restitution payments and community service. Peter had been forced to sell the Newton house to pay back some of the money he'd stolen, and Sharon's influencer business had collapsed entirely after her fraud convictions became public. More importantly, I'd been busy building something new. The Massachusetts Women's Shelter Network had used my donation to open 3 new facilities, providing safe havens for women escaping domestic violence. The scholarship fund had already awarded its first grants to 25 first-generation college students, including Marcus Johnson's younger sister. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been my relationship with Lexi. After the graduation party revelation, she'd reached out to me repeatedly, eager to understand the truth about our family's history and her own role in my exile. We'd had long conversations about integrity, responsibility, and the importance of making independent judgments rather than blindly following others' lead. She'd surprised me by asking to interview me for a podcast series she was creating about elder abuse and family dynamics. "I want people to understand what happened to you," she'd said. "I want them to know that elderly people aren't helpless victims, that they can fight back when they're treated badly." The podcast, titled Elder Power, "The Woman Who Outplayed Her Family," had become unexpectedly popular. Lexi's generation was fascinated by the story of an elderly woman who'd used her business skills and financial resources to deliver justice to those who'd betrayed her. I'd received hundreds of emails from listeners sharing their own stories of family betrayal and expressing gratitude for my example. Aidan had also made an effort to rebuild our relationship, though his progress was slower and more cautious than his sister's. He'd visited me several times, bringing flowers and asking questions about the real estate business. I'd begun teaching him about property investment and financial planning, hoping to pass on some of the knowledge I'd accumulated over my career. As for Peter and Sharon, they'd become cautionary tales in Newton society. Their divorce had been finalized the previous month, with Sharon moving to Florida to start over with what remained of her savings. Peter had taken a job with a small accounting firm, a dramatic come-down from his previous success, but perhaps a necessary lesson in humility. He'd written me several letters over the past few months, attempting to apologize and rebuild our relationship. I'd read each one carefully, but I hadn't responded. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and some lessons could only be learned through consequences. As I settled into my new life in Rockport, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The woman who'd been discarded on Christmas morning had emerged stronger, more purposeful, and more respected than ever before. I'd learned that age didn't have to mean powerlessness, that accumulated wisdom and resources could be formidable weapons when wielded with precision and determination. My days were now filled with meaningful work, consulting with other elderly people who faced similar challenges, serving on boards of organizations I cared about, and mentoring young people who reminded me of the person I'd once been. I'd discovered that retirement from family obligations could be liberation, that choosing your own family was sometimes better than accepting the one you'd been born into. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after my exile, I hosted a dinner party in my new home. The guests included Louis and his family, Rita and her daughter, Harvey and his son, Dolores and her granddaughter, and several of the scholarship recipients who'd driven up from Boston for the occasion. As we gathered around my dining room table, I looked at the faces of people who'd become more than friends. They'd become the family I'd chosen, the people who saw me as I truly was, rather than as they wanted me to be. The contrast with the hollow Christmas celebration that had preceded my exile was stark and satisfying. During dessert, Marcus Johnson stood up to offer a toast. "To Eleanor Whittaker," he said, raising his glass. "A woman who taught us that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about respect, loyalty, and love. A woman who showed us that it's never too late to start over, to demand better, to choose happiness over duty." As the others raised their glasses, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The game was over, justice had been served, and I'd built something new from the ashes of my old life. At 82, I was finally living exactly as I chose, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and respected my autonomy. That night, as I prepared for bed in my cozy cottage overlooking the harbor, I opened my journal and wrote a final entry about the experience that had transformed my life. This Christmas, I sat at the head of my own table, surrounded by people who chose to love me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to start over, to demand better, to refuse to be diminished by others' expectations. I am Eleanor Whitaker, and I am exactly where I belong. As I closed the journal and turned off the light, I smiled at the snow beginning to fall outside my window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new ways to use my remaining years to make a difference in the world. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I was, free, respected, and surrounded by love that was genuine, rather than obligatory. The woman who'd been dumped in a nursing home on Christmas morning had not only survived, she'd triumphed, and that was a story worth telling.